Good evening and welcome to this special edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Reagan King and joined as always by my good friend and co-host Simon Barrett. And we have a wonderful privilege to once more host special guest, Major Retired Rhett Parkinson of the Armed Forces Christian Union. Evening to you both, welcome.
Right. Good evening, Reagan.
And we're going to be talking about the 80th anniversary of the important Battle of the Bulge, particularly honing in on the significance, the spiritual significance of US General Patton's prayer, which changed the course of this immensely important battle. It would eventually see Winston Churchill declare it the best battle that the Americans fought in the entirety of the war. So, Major Rhett, first over to you. Tell us initially your ideas, your thoughts concerning the Battle of the Bulge and its importance to the course of World War II.
Well, I think we have to sort of set it in context in terms of it's coming towards the back end of the war. We've opened up the Western Front with D-Day landings, and things have been going fairly well up until the September time. The weather closed in November, December, and many people remember 1944 as one of the coldest, most bitter winters. A lot of people actually in Europe, in Holland and elsewhere, were dying of starvation. So the weather was incredibly important, and it had been so muddy and wet that actually a lot of the fighting had died down. There were still some little pockets of bitter fighting here and there, but in terms of large-scale sweeping manoeuvres across Europe, they'd ground to a halt in the West. The Russians were still grinding away on the Eastern Front, but the war was far from over, and the Germans certainly had not given up the fight. And as we'll discuss, they managed to pull quite a surprise on all the Allies, particularly the Western Allies.
Well, between the 16th of December over the Christmas period to the 25th of January of 1945, Simon, we see in the Arden forest this massive battle take place, and it was essentially a counteroffensive against the Allied troops, of course, having already passed D-Day, having already seen a great deal of territory taken. They're seeking to put up great resistance to the Allied attempts to invade Germany and push the Nazis further back. Tell us a little bit of what led to this and how it began to unfold.
Well, essentially, if we look at the Battle of the Bulge, I mean, this was Hitler's counter-offensive against the Allied forces because he wanted to protect the German homeland from invasion. Now, what's interesting is that many of Hitler's generals advised against this operation to actually take out and cut the Allied lines in half, and this is why it's called the Battle of the Bulge, because they thought there was only a 10% chance of the SS and the German Wehrmacht actually being successful in carrying out this mission. But of course, you know, that he was the supreme leader, he was the Führer, and no one challenges the Führer. So this is why he kind of made this audacious attempt to break the Allied lines and then encircle some of the British and Allied forces in order to kind of delay the Allied invasion of Germany, because at that time it had been mobilizing very fast, and of course Hitler was also then worried about what was happening in the east with the Russian Red Army moving at speed right across Eastern Europe on its way to Germany. So lots of different dynamics as well. But personally, I want to thank you, Rhett, for joining us today. And thank you very much for the Armed Forces Christian Union tie that you give me for my birthday. So I'm wearing it with honour, with all respect to Christians serving in our armed forces today. But I think it's also important to put things in context. I mean, I think when you look back at the Second World War, 1944 was a very, very significant year because, of course, it was D-Day. This was and we covered a program back in June, the 80th anniversary, the biggest landing force ever amassed in the history of military warfare, and to have that bridgehead in northern France to begin the liberation of Europe was key. But do you want to unpack for us a little bit more about how significant this was and how long it took the Allies really to actually then conquer, regain France from Nazi occupation, before then we can talk about what was an ill-fated mission known as Operation Market Garden on September the 17th, 1944, with the famous story of the bridge too far.
So I think the other thing to just remember in terms of the overall context is I think Hitler realised that he was losing on the Eastern Front, and that actually another few divisions were just going to go into the meat grinder, and the Russians would just roll over him. So if he had any chance to shape the remainder of the war, what he was looking for was a way to split the Allies, and particularly the Western Allies. And there'd been a lot of friction, which was quite widely acknowledged between especially Patton and Montgomery, going right back to Operation Husky in Sicily in 1943, where they'd fallen out really badly. And with that gap between the Battle of Normandy, which was 6th of June all the way to the end of August, where it finished with the Great Swan, 10 days, where many of the tanks and troops were covering up to 1,000 kilometres in their vehicles. The Germans had thrown everything into trying to defend Normandy, and then lost a huge amount with an ill-fated sort of counter-offensive towards the end of it, got trapped in the Falaise pocket, and then basically had nothing to fall back on. So even the natural obstacles like the River Seine, which was a substantial obstacle, should have been for the Allies to get over. They didn't have time to blow the bridges. They didn't have the troops to protect their home bank anyways. And so what happened by mid-September, was they'd run out of logistics. And so the Allies were having to then push their logistics 1,000 kilometres forward from the Normandy beaches. Although they'd taken Antwerp, they hadn't taken all the approaches. Antwerp's quite inland from the sea, and therefore they were still having to push their logistics an awfully long way and then make a decision as to, was it going to go towards the British and Montgomery and the Canadians, or was it going to go to the Americans and Patton and others?
Well, there was doubtless friction as a result of all of the ins and outs of that discourse, but we also can't leave out the human element of this, because we've just seen catastrophic loss on the Normandy beaches. I mean, just a reminder that it was the 6th of June of 1944 that we saw 156,000 British, American and Canadian soldiers land on the 50 miles of Normandy's northern French beaches. And, you know, while successful, while there was victory ultimately and they began to make inroads, the human reality of it is that these are individuals who have just seen their friends, their brothers even, in many cases, lose their lives. And, you know, there would have doubtless been also blame shared among different individuals. There may have been a lack of morale that was increasing, and certainly the Nazis were aware, Hitler certainly was aware that this sort of friction, despite great victory, there could also be a low that would swiftly follow, and that was something to be capitalized on. And that was the attempt really behind this battle in the Ardennes forest.
And they'd done it before. They did it in June 1940, which in May 1940, in 6 weeks, they'd gone from the German border through the Ardennes all the way to around Calais, Boulogne, Dunkirk, and it led to our somewhat glorious but ignominious defeat and evacuation from Dunkirk, again, weather played a huge part in that successful evacuation, as it were. But I think that also played in Hitler's mind that actually, and I know some of the lower, I'll tell one or two stories of some of the SS officers who played a part in that great advance, lightning advance, the Blitzkrieg, as it blasted across France in 1940. And I think Hitler clearly thought, well, if we get Antwerp and we split the Americans and the British and Canadians, then we'll repeat what we did 4 and a half years ago, and it'll all win with a better negotiating position for the end of the war.
I also read, so I think Operation Market Garden, and of course it was made famous by that incredible film in the 70s called A Bridge Too Far, really showed how I think Montgomery believed, for example, that they could get into Germany quicker. So they thought that by December 1944, the Allies could actually then take over and bring the war to an end and bring Germany to a crushing defeat, with probably the biggest airborne division and paratroopers in the course of the war landing in Arnhem and taking a lot of the Netherlands, including Eindhoven. Share with us how this ended up being an absolute military disaster.
Well, lots of things went wrong. I mean, actually, the concept was brilliant. And even the German generals who ended up fighting and countering that air assault, particularly around Normandy, recognized that they thought that was one of the best strategic plans, or operational plans anyway, in the war. But the issue being that so many things went wrong. The intelligence was not passed up to higher. The British had intelligence. Certainly one major who was an intelligence officer was sent on leave when he started reporting that, you know, there were tanks, possibly one, maybe two SS divisions in the Arnhem area. Secondly, the RAF felt that Arnhem was just too heavily defended with anti-aircraft guns, and they pushed quite hard for the paratroopers, the British paratroopers, because of course the Americans landed 2 divisions further south. They were relieved fairly quickly. It was the British that really came a cropper. And they pushed quite hard for the landing points to be 8 to 10 miles outside of Arnhem, and then they got on their feet and had to walk in. Ironically, the intelligence also about potential landing sites around Arnhem itself, the plan had been to land 3 brigades on the bridge effectively, and they thought the casualties would be far too high and the ground wasn't suitable. Actually, the anti-aircraft fire was much lower than they expected. The ground would have been absolutely suitable. And then the other thing, which was probably unintended, unanticipated, is the Dutch people came out to celebrate their freedom. They recognised that, you know, here were the Allies. And so rather than making 4 miles an hour and getting in a couple of 3 hours into the middle of Arnhem and on the bridge, they ended up being effectively held up by the local civilians and then increasingly the German resistance. So it was only 1 battalion that made it through. And sadly,
I mean, it's extraordinary, this one, according to the research notes here, that 35,000 parachute and glider troops were involved in operation with some early success. And this one is bigging the turn about to be a massive disaster. And there's also an incredible story I read recently, in the Sunday Times, and it refers to the fact that they felt that there was a spy in the heart of the British War Cabinet who was very sympathetic to the Soviets. So passed on information about Operation Market Garden to the Germans to delay, for example, the Allies' march on Germany so that the Soviets could get and conquer most of Germany and become the winners, as it were, in the Second World War. And it was done because of their sympathy, not for the Nazis, but for the Soviets. And they felt that this is why the Germans knew that this was coming. But looking at the casualties, though, 1,485 British and Polish airborne troops were killed or died of their wounds. 6,525 became prisoners of war. So surely this was a bridge too far, to actually quote the famous Hollywood film.
I think it was about 10,000 British glider and parachute troops who were dropped into Arnhem. So yes, I mean, to lose effectively 2/3, I think it was only about 2,000 that made it back across the river towards the end of the 10-12 days where they were evacuated back onto the home side, the home bank, as it were. Yeah, I think it's very easy on hindsight, especially 80 years later, to sit and critique. And I think within weeks there was a lot of analysis, and some of the lessons learned were immediately applied to the Rhine crossings and the operation, the huge operation that had been planned for 2 or 3 years before certainly the Western Allies, the British and the Americans, crossed the Rhine. For example, They tried dropping Paras by night in Normandy. That had been chaotic, very hard to reorg on the landing zones. So they decided in Arnhem to do it by day, but that gave the anti-aircraft gunners more opportunity to shoot them down. And so actually for crossing the Rhine, they decided to drop them very successfully as at dawn as the sunlight was coming up. So it wasn't all wasted. There were lessons being constantly learned throughout the war.
And certainly those lessons would have had some impact as we arrive at the Battle of the Bulge. Now, the issue is this is Adolf Hitler's essentially his last full-on onslaught against the Allied forces. This is the last opportunity, it's make or break. And there does seem at the beginning of this battle to be the possibility that the Allies could be defeated in this and that victory in Europe could be that much further away. Winston Churchill would describe this battle as, quote, the greatest American battle of the war, and it would take place there in the Ardennes forest over 6 brutal weeks. Tell us a little bit about how cataclysmic a moment this was for the course of World War II as a whole.
Well, I think we have to sort of take our minds back to the middle of December 1944. It had been raining for weeks. Everything was covered in mud. The Allies were struggling just to survive, let alone continue the offensive. It was happening, and I've walked the ground and I've been into places that after 48 hours, a particular strong point on a crossroads in a forest was taken, and then the following day the Battle of the Bulge was launched. That whole assault. Also of interest, in 44, the Allies were making the same assumptions that actually were fatally flawed in 1940, i.e., well, who would fight in the Ardennes forest? Because it's very close country. It's not tank country at all. It's quite hard to move tank forces or armoured forces through that. And so where much of the sector that was attacked, I think from memory it was the 116th Infantry Division, had recently arrived from America. They were very green. They were trying to get used to living in austere conditions out in the fields. They had rudimentary trenches, but they hadn't faced any combat. So we're not talking about hardened American troops. At the operational and strategic level, the Allies did not see this coming at all. This was at every level, from tactical, operational, strategic. This was a complete surprise to the Allies. And so they weren't on high alert. They were all sort of looking at Christmas, thinking about another Christmas away from home. There was still green, untried divisions being fed slowly into the front line. Their front lines were very thinly stretched. So they did have troops out, but not many. And so when the Germans did mass significant force with surprise, it quickly overwhelmed a lot of the frontline positions.
Yeah, because what we saw as well was that the German forces drove into the Ardennes, and the figures are extraordinary. So in this war, the course of the war, which took place from the 16th of December 1944 right through to the 25th of January 1945, we saw that some 30 German divisions were attacking the battle fatigue American soldiers. Show us a thought what it would have been like to be one of those American soldiers in the Ardennes, knowing that the Germans had sent a division, 30 divisions to attack their front lines. And of course dealing with the kind of the German Panzer tanks and the Tiger tanks, which were far more superior than the kind of American Sherman tanks.
Well, I think, as I said, they were very thinly stretched. So actually there's a real sense of isolation. The guys wouldn't necessarily be in touch with, particularly on the significant boundaries, the divisional and the corps boundaries. They wouldn't necessarily know who was, how close the other troops were. There would be small amounts of infantry in their trenches. They may have their own integral mortars in support of them, but they would have to call in artillery, tanks, and the tanks just aren't very many in the initial couple of days. This was not an area that was seen as a significant threat. It was not seen as a significant piece of terrain at all in any way, and so I think For those who weren't immediately caught in the fight, or surprised or ambushed, and maybe we'll talk about the Malmedy massacre shortly, a lot of them, it was complete chaos. The initial sort of reports, one of the things you find in the battlefield when you're out and about, especially as junior soldiers, is the lack of information. And so the rumours were starting to, within 12 to 24 hours, there was, well, that sounds like, artillery fire, and somebody's running back and saying, medics, we need some medics, we need some ammunition. It's like, what's happening? And so there was a lot of confusion initially, all the way from the private soldiers right up to the generals of, well, hang on, this makes no sense. We've got no intelligence that the Germans are attacking. And if they are, is this just a local attack, or is this a more significant attack, or is it, as it turned out, an offensive with 30 German divisions barreling across the German border?
And this is spread across an 85-mile battlefront, essentially.
Yes.
And so it's very thin in regards to just the layout of it. And you can, if you put that into perspective a little bit, just to try to imagine the troops spread out over 85 miles and recognize what you're saying, the chaos, the lack of information. We didn't have the same technologies that we have today, and so so much of it would be by word of mouth. There would be splits in the communication, and rumor also could spread. And this is to some degree what happens when there's this surprise German attack which breaks through the front on day one, as stories have quickly spread of massacred soldiers and civilians, according to the U.S. Army Center of Military History.
And I like also what U.S. Army Charlie Sanderson, who wrote in My Father's War, Memory from Honoured World War II Soldiers, said about this Nazi counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge. He said, "Did you ever see a land when tornadoes come through? Did you ever see trees and stuff twisted and broken off? The whole friggin' forest was like that."
Well, that's a common sight in the United States, in that region that I grew up in, Tornado Alley, where you see just the splits and the breaks, and it's absolute chaos. So seeing that as a battleground, while the U.S. Army was seeking to hack in and get itself entrenched, it's not ideal terrain for this battle.
No, and I think the initial reaction is one of shock. I think the scale of it was shocking. I think when soldiers were trying to put up a bit of resistance, if you've got a section of 8, 10, often they were working in sort of 13, 14-man sections, you've never heard a artillery shell land anywhere near you. You've never been under machine gun fire from the MG42s. You've never faced the Germans. You've been training maybe for 6 months a year. You've mobilized, answered the call to arms, and you've been training and you've traveled, and you're freezing and you're cold. And suddenly you're either in the battle, or there are people withdrawing through you and they're injured and they're frightened and scared. And certainly the feeling amongst the senior Allied generals in the first 2 or 3 days was significant concern that the whole front would collapse, that the Germans would actually achieve what they were seeking to do, which was trying to reach Antwerp as quickly as they could. And it's interesting, certainly having done a walk the ground, as it were, where the Malmedy massacre occurred, and there are lots of different conflicting reports. I mean, there was a lot of confusion, but nearly 100 American artillerymen were captured by the SS in a Kampfgruppe Piper, which is like a brigade, a German brigade, and it was commanded by this General Joachim Piper, who'd fought on the Eastern Front, and there were quite a few stories of massacres and so on. And his exact orders are a little bit confusing. We haven't got time for prisoners. Don't take prisoners. Well, does that mean just bypass anybody, or does that mean get rid of the prisoners? And were they trying to escape or not? Because they're entitled to being protected if they're prisoners of war, but if they're trying to escape, then it's fair to shoot them. So there's all of that happening. Anyway, the net result was the vast majority of that unit were killed in cold blood. They'd surrendered and put their weapons down, but 2 or 3 managed to get back to Allied lines. And very quickly, the Americans decided to use that to try and bring a bit of resistance and desire to fight, to try and increase that will to fight amongst American soldiers. And so the story of the Malmedy massacre was spread far and wide very quickly. So basically the message was, don't surrender because you too might be shot. Why don't you fight? And there's a great little anecdote of an infanteer, and people are withdrawing past him, and he's digging a hole on a crossroads, and somebody stops and says, "Hey mate, what are you doing?" And he said, "I've been running for the last couple of days. I'm not running in front of these Germans anymore." And so some other guys start digging in, and then a tank destroyer comes past and said, "Well, if you're going to make a stand here, then I'm going to make a stand." And this whole sort of ad hoc little task force appears, and when the Germans do come up to that crossroads, they give them a bloody nose and have a good fight.
But also the other problem linked to this one as well is that the History Channel actually says that another Nazi strategy at the time was the attempt to infiltrate Allied troops, and the veteran Vermont Brantley, who was a private in the first class of the 289th Regiment, told the Fort Jackson leader back in 2009 that his unit had just arrived in Germany from France when they were being told to load up and return to Luxembourg. He said, "We got word that the Germans had dropped a lot of paratroopers behind our lines. They were dressed like American soldiers, spoke English," and he said that they were there to create confusion. The Germans also changed the road signs and spread misinformation. So share with us the impact that would have had, knowing that behind the Allied American lines were German paratroopers pretending to be American soldiers, and of course then probably no doubt firing on the American troops that are there anyway, adding to more confusion and fear in this situation.
Yeah, so I think some of them have been infiltrated, and I think this was the last time the Germans used paratroopers, so terrible weather, but they dropped or attempted to drop a number of paratroopers. But yeah, I mean, it's a terrible film, The Battle of the Bulge, filmed in the late 60s, but it does portray some of the military police being exactly these Germans in American uniforms, and I even understand the unit had been specially selected and trained. They had good grasp of English. And they'd been sort of infiltrated in some of the prisoner of war camps to improve their slang and their English or American English to blend in with the troops. That would have added to all the confusion and chaos that you have on a battlefield even today. I'm sure if you went and spoke to any of the Ukrainian or Russian soldiers, there is chaos and fear and uncertainty, and you don't know what is really happening, because your information that's coming down to you is limited. If that's then confused because the signs are being turned around and people are pointing you in the wrong direction down to the local German units rather than back to your own Allied lines as you're trying to withdraw, that just adds significant confusion to the whole battlefield.
Well, when you're already in some way being influenced by some of the horrifying elements of the freezing cold, I mean, you have individuals, one guy from Buffalo, which is freezing, to this day you'll have right now, it's piled high with snow in the Buffalo region of New York. He says, "I thought I knew cold, but I didn't really know cold until the Battle of the Bulge." So you have those external elements that are impacting you, that are affecting you, that are making you suffer to some degree. And then on top of that, you have the rumor, the reality of spies, of individuals who you don't know really who you can trust fully. If you've never met these individuals before, someone appears, you have to gauge. Now, the Life magazine in 1945 was reporting on what happened, and it says that the Nazis were carefully groomed for their dangerous mission. They spoke excellent English. Their slang had been turned up by close association with American prisoners of war in German camps. And under the rules of the Hague Convention, these Germans were classifiable as spies. They were revealed to be German, revealed to be Nazis, and they were subject to immediate court-martial by military tribunal where they were found guilty, and of course they had the usual penalty for spies ordered, which was death by firing squad.
Yeah, another thing what to bring in, I think, is very strategic, isn't it? And that's the Battle of the Bastogne, which is that town which interlinks everything within the Ardennes forest. And any of our viewers who have watched the Band of Brothers will know the 2 episodes set in this whole area of Belgium and this whole area of Luxembourg with the Battle of the Ardennes. Tell us, Rhett, the strategic importance of the Bastogne region and town, and how the American 101 Airborne Division played a key role in actually protecting that town from the German onslaught, which was incredible, and how one of the US generals, in response to saying, do the 101 Division want to surrender? And his response was nuts to the Germans, which is incredible.
Yeah, so there were 2 sort of key towns really behind the front line, behind the Allied front lines. One was St. Vith, which the Allies fought hard to protect, but eventually withdrew from. And then General Patton and others, recognised that Bastogne was key, and within about 48 hours of the commencement of the German offensive, the German attack, the order was given for the 101st to move into and around that whole area. And I've stood in the trenches of Easy Company just outside of Bastogne, and the Germans for days and days put numerous attacks, not particularly well coordinated, interestingly, attacks in and around, and they were, initially assaulting directly from the east, and then they tried around the south and around the north, and even from the west. They completely surrounded it and moved on. And I think you get a feel for, if you've either read the book or particularly watched the film around A Band of Brothers, the sheer ferociousness of the attacks, the medical casualties not being able to be evacuated properly, limited ammunition, no resupply in terms of men. It was a brutal attack, but it wasn't especially well prosecuted by the Germans. They weren't, by this stage of the war, they were struggling to put an effective combined arms attack in with artillery softening up a target and then bringing in sort of tanks and troops in some form of protected mobility so that they could be protected onto the positions and then attack the positions properly. And even at this stage, although there were SS tank divisions and so on, they still had horse-drawn artillery. So when they moved forward at any speed in any given area, it would take a while to bring the reinforcements, as a lot of the infantry were on their feet. They were short of everything, particularly fuel at this stage.
And also, I think an important component in this one, and this is again where the weather plays a major role. I mean, we've already talked about the torrential rain and the freezing cold conditions, but that also then prevented the RAF and the American Air Force from giving protection to those US troops that had to face the onslaught of this huge Nazi advance on them. Just share with us how not having that air support really did actually confound and make matters far worse in the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah, I think the Allies by this stage pretty much had air superiority, not supremacy. So the Luftwaffe were around, but not very much. And they were the Allies could put far more aircraft, fighters, bombers, everything into the sky. And part of the reasoning that this battle happened when it did and where it did was because they knew the weather would be bad. The Germans knew the weather would be bad, and they'd learnt through the summer that basically anything that moved by day, if the skies were clear, was very vulnerable. And whether they were tanks or artillery or ammunition, fuel, they all were attacked heavily from the air. So we were trying to maintain that air superiority, but you can't fly when the weather, even today, the Royal Air Force doesn't like flying when the clouds come down. Back then we didn't have any of the kind of technology that we do now, and so effectively the Germans are quite happy to move by day and by night because they had this thick heavy grey cloud cover. A lot of snow was falling. If you look at all the pictures and the films, there's snow covered across the ground. It's frosty. The ground is hard. That's helping the armour move quickly. But the sky is closed to any kind of aircraft at all on either side.
This is really where one of the most significant characters of World War II needs to be introduced, as we see he and some actions he undertook in the Battle of the Bulge had a cataclysmic impact on the course of that battle, and indeed began to see out the end and conclusion of World War II. This is, of course, General George Patton, and he was born in 1885 in San Gabriel, California. He would go on to die, actually, only a little bit a year later, December of 1945, yeah, in Heidelberg, Germany. He was a U.S. Army officer who has a reputation as an outstanding practitioner of U.S. tank warfare. He particularly served in the European and Mediterranean theaters in World War II, and he was known for strict discipline, toughness. He had a foul mouth as well.
And a short temper.
Yeah, very short. Yeah, that kind of foul mouth, toughness, short temper goes together with his reputation as a general. He was not known as a spiritual man by any means, I don't think. To the degree that we're talking about the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, and there was quite a major story, Simon, that you came across that was like, hold on, where did this come from? But it's probably the most significant story of this battle.
No, absolutely. But also, I think going back to General Patton, for example, now he made his way, his mark in the US military through commanding the tanks in the First World War, which gave him that kind of tank experience. And he kind of had dyslexia and kind of worked his way up the ranks, and then just proved himself at every.
He was a military historian,
but he was also an athlete. He competed for the United States in the Olympic Games as well. So yeah, we're dealing with an extraordinary individual. What are your thoughts on US General Patton?
I think he's controversial in terms of his character, but brilliant as a tactician, and certainly the Germans rated him as one of the best. In fact, he had a fairly quiet start, well, as much as generals ever have a quiet time, in April, May, June, July, where the Allies let it be known that he was commanding the Fifth Army in the UK, and they were there posturing to attack across the Pas-de-Calais. And so because the Allies knew he was highly rated by the Germans, they'd kept him back in England as a potential threat across the Pas-de-Calais, and it worked. Hitler was convinced that Normandy was a feint, and that the main attack would come across the Pas-de-Calais. By July 44, it was very obvious that even the Allies, with all their almost endless resources, were putting effort into Normandy, and that was the main attack. Yeah. And Patton was given, from really the end of July 44, command of the Third Army, and was making great gains. He swept all the way around the back of Normandy up to Falaise, and that created the Falaise pocket. He then was part of that sort of big swan through September. The challenge, the frustration he had was he was not getting the priority, because it went to Montgomery and Operation Market Garden, and he actually felt quite betrayed. He felt his soldiers were dying because they didn't have enough ammunition and fuel to get on and do the business. But he very quickly realised what was happening within 48 hours, and he pivoted his whole army from attacking east to going straight north and attacking. He was given command of the whole of the southern sector of the Battle of the Bulge, to pinch out the Bulge. The northern sector, much to the Americans' chagrin, went to Montgomery, and they were very unhappy about having any American soldiers under command of Montgomery, who they despised and didn't think was a particularly good general.
And this brings us into this gem of the story. So sometimes you can do research, and when I asked you to cover this story, Rhett, I had no idea about this hidden gem of history, and this is God's hand, sovereign hand, working behind the scenes. And this is the incredible story of US General Patton's prayer. Now, what he asked for in early December of 1944, as you discussed earlier in the program, Rhett, with the torrential rain, he wanted a prayer for good weather. So he asked his chaplain, is there a prayer that we can pray for good weather? And do you want to tell us the story?
Well, so he was in a foul mood because of the bad weather. I mean, this is kind of par for the course, I think, and when we experience some of the dreary December mess. But imagine that on a battlefield, low morale and all of that. He's in a very foul mood, and his Third Army was stalled in Lorraine, wearing out after a fall of this depressing attrition. Every day the weather would get worse. There were apparently 4 inches of liquid mud over everything. He would write his wife, Beatrice, it rains all the time, not hard, but steadily. And so you think of that just slogging through. Also, there's poor visibility. It's freezing. And so he believes, it's time to see if something can intervene. And the Liberation Route writes this story and says he decided to muster some divine intervention. And at 11 a.m. on December the 8th of 1944, he picked up the telephone in his office, and he contacted 52-year-old Chief Chaplain of the Third Army, James H. O'Neill, and asked, do you have a good prayer for weather? We must do something about those rains if we are to win the war. This was, of course, a very unusual request, even from, perhaps especially from someone like General Patton. And O'Neill would tell Patton that, okay, I'll find a suitable prayer, and he couldn't find one, so he jotted one down on a card. He put his overcoat on, walked over to the barracks and presented it to Patton, who looked at it and said, have 250,000 copies printed. See to it that every man in the Third Army gets one. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, and he also went on to say there that O'Neill was surprised by the number, and this is his quote. He said, this was certainly doing something about the weather in a big way. And he said, very well, sir, yes. The chaplain sat down for a moment. I want to talk to you about the business of prayer. O'Neill did what he was ordered. He had grown to admire Patton. The general cared about his men, hot meals wherever possible, and even had kind of dry socks. But this is what he says, which is amazing. He said, the chaplain, how much prayer is being done in the Third Army? Asked Patton. Does the general mean chaplains or by men? And he said, no, by everyone. And he said, I'm afraid to admit, but I do not believe that much prayer is going on. When there is fighting, everyone prays. But now with this constant rain, when things are quiet, dangerously quiet, men just sit up and wait for things to happen. Up to now, in the Third Army, God has been very good to us, said Patton. We've never retreated. We've never suffered no defeats. This is because a lot of people back home are praying for us. We are lucky in Africa, in Sicily and Italy, simply because people prayed. But we have to pray for ourselves too. And I'll let you read the other quote in a minute. But this is extraordinary, isn't it? We have here the general of the US Third Army asking his army chaplain, is there a prayer for good weather? Needing he wanted divine intervention, and realised that this battle was not going to be won on the battlefield, but this battle was going to be won on the heavenlies. As a Christian who served in our armed forces, just share with us your thoughts of the conclusion that General Patton came to.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think we have a sort of fairly apathetic view of God generally in this nation and in many of the Western nations today. And I would totally identify and recognise that description of what the chaplain said. So chaplains are trained and encouraged, and they are told, it's a famous quote, pray for your men always. And sometimes you can share the gospel and have opportunities to talk about it. But for your average soldier and officer, including some of our senior officers, they don't turn to God until the chips are absolutely down. When things are really difficult, or you need to go into the corner and open the lid and invite God out of his box to come and intervene. And General Patton's kind of doing this in a spectacular level. And I love the fact that, the chaplain's almost implying, well, it's the chaplain's job to pray. And General Patton's going, not good enough. I want my whole army praying. And the whole army, I think the last of the prayer, hopefully you're going to read the prayer out shortly, but the last prayer card was delivered to the last soldier about 2 days, around about the 14th of December, about 2 days before the Germans came across the border. And I wonder how many of them were pulling that card out and praying their socks off that the weather would improve so that the aircraft could be brought in to make a difference.
Well, there was definitely the recognition that the soldiers were cracking, and Patton recognized by telling O'Neill that soldiers should pray wherever they found themselves. If they didn't, they'd sooner or later go to pieces and crack up. That this was essential not just for their success in the battle, but for their own mental, emotional and spiritual well-being and stability. So O'Neill returned to his quarters. He issued the directive, and in Patton's name, 250,000 of these cards were printed up. 486 chaplains distributed these cards, and these guys represented 32 different denominations. They worked together, senior officers in more than 20 divisions. And they urged everyone to pray when driving, pray when fighting, pray alone, pray with others, pray by night and pray by day, pray for the cessation of immoderate rains, for good weather, for battle, pray for victory, pray for our army, and pray for peace.
That's extraordinary. And I think we can learn something this from day that, okay, we're not facing the Nazis, we're not actually engaged in a war on the scale of the Second World War, but we're also engaged in a spiritual war, and so we need to pray every ceasing moment. This is what I've taken from this research and this program today. But it's also interesting how on the 14th of December, it says the last of Patton's 250,000, that's 250,000 prayer cards were distributed to his men. The timing of the delivery could not have been better. Just 2 days later, a calamity struck on the Western Front. Hitler launched his last surprise gamble to change the outcome of the war. The surprise strike by over 200,000 troops that became known as the Battle of the Bulge. It said among Allies commanders, Patton emerged from the crisis with his reputation enhanced. He brilliantly pivoted his Third Army, sending his favourite division, the 4th Armoured, to relieve the besieged 101 Airborne at Bastogne. And then we also see miraculously that the weather changed on the 25th of December.
Have you got the prayer?
Yeah,
Let's hear the prayer.
So the prayer is very simply this: grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee, that armed with thy power we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish thy justice among men and nations. Amen. And the weather changed.
Absolutely. And also, I mean, to talk about the character of General Patton as well, he wrote in his diary, what a glorious day for killing Germans. So as soon as the weather lifted and he got his prayer answered, we see then that he said, what a brilliant day for killing Germans, kind of in response. But there was this righteous indignation, I think, that General Patton had, knowing the true nature of who the Germans were, the Nazis, what they committed and what they were doing, and how he was essentially fighting for Christian civilization. But I mean, I've done, and we've done many programs with you, Rhett. Again, how much does God intervene when it comes to the weather? Whether this is the Battle of Waterloo, where the weather actually worked on side of the British and the Prussians in actually halting Napoleon's advance of the Battle of Waterloo, which slowed his horses, his armoured division. They were stuck in the mud, which then bought Wellington enough time to actually destroy and defeat Napoleon on the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. And then we also see things happen like this in the First World War, but the Second World War, as you mentioned at the beginning of the programme, Dunkirk, we were liberated because of the weather. The D-Day landings couldn't happen if it wasn't for the weather. Just share with us how, again, God uses weather to change the outcome, and through prayer we have breakthrough, whether it's prayer and intercession, whether it's the prayer of General Patton, whether it's the prayer of the chaplains, or prayer of the US Third Army, have actually achieved this breakthrough because God is the God of history, because history is his story after all.
Well, I forget who, forgive me, I forget who originally came up with the quote, but I don't believe in consequences, but I do believe that when I pray, God answers, and there are significant things that happen. I've butchered that quote. But it's interesting that throughout, in the First World War, the king called the nation to prayer. For some reason, he waited till August 1918, but for 100 days after the king called the nation to pray, and the nation prayed. We never lost a battle. It was the great offensive that never stopped until the 11th of November 1918. And then again, turn the clocks forward to May 1940, and the king calls the first of 7 days, 7 different occasions, he calls the nation to prayer. And because we were up against it and we had no other hope really other than God stepping in, the queues were out of and round the churches throughout London and the whole nation in May 1940. By 1944-45, and I forget when the last sort of national day of prayer was, the attendance in churches was far lower. But you can trace significant battles, Battle of the El Alamein, the second Battle of El Alamein in 1942, back in 42, to name another one. You can see how there's significant answers every time the nation prays. And so as Christians, I firmly believe that wherever we are, however far from the front line the physical soldiers are fighting in the front line, we're all in the spiritual warfare, and we all have a part to play in that battle.
When Patton, when he gave this prayer and they prayed this prayer, it was on Christmas Day, actually, that the weather finally changed. One GI said it was the war's most beautiful sunrise. And that enabled then the Allied air forces to strike, clearing the way for forthcoming victory. It was on that bright, clear and cold Christmas morning in 1944 that the ground froze solid. One individual told the leader, the tanks and air forces could finally maneuver and get assistance to all of us who were previously blocked off. It was a welcome sign to see the sun come up. It meant that we were alive after one more day. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, led the American defense to restore the front. According to the National Archives' bloodiest battle, Eisenhower then gave Patton the Third Army about 230,000 soldiers, ordering him to head to the Ardennes.
And this, we have to conclude with this because this is a brilliant story. It reminds me the kind of story of Esther, where Mordecai is awarded by the king, and it's a similar thing with the chaplain. So this says, Patton did not forget to thank Chief Chaplain for his prayer. He said, I'm not going to mention that because I don't use God's name in vain, but he said, damn. He said, Patton explained on one day that O'Neill sure did some potent praying. He said, get him up here, I want to pin a medal on him. Father O'Neill was brought to see Patton. Chaplain, you are the most popular man in this headquarters, said Patton. You sure stand in good with the Lord and with the soldiers. Patton pinned the Bronze Star on O'Neill's chest, making him the only man to be awarded a medal in World War II for writing a prayer. So it says here that O'Neill recalled, as General Patton rushed his divisions to the relief of the beleaguered Bastogne, the prayer was answered. It was bad news for the Germans, but was much to the delight of the American forecasters, who were equally surprised at the turnabout. The rains and the fogs ceased. General Patton prayed for fair weather for the battle. He got it. Inspirational.
Truly is.
Show this your response to that here we are, a chaplain being awarded the Bronze Star Medal because he wrote a prayer.
I think it's fantastic, and it shows again, reminds us again, at a time where our nation is becoming increasingly secular and our chaplains Christian chaplains are being squeezed, that actually when the chips are down, when we really need hope, when we really need to, and many people want to, turn to God, having chaplains in our armed forces is absolutely key. And this is another great example where you've got the right people. God has placed the right people in the right place at the right time and stirred the heart of a pretty godless man, let's face it, like General Patton, to turn to his chaplain and say, we need divine help and you're the man to deliver that. Fantastic.
In all, according to the U.S. Department of Defense, 1 million plus Allied troops, including some 500,000 Americans, fought in the Battle of the Bulge, with approximately 19,000 soldiers killed in action, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 plus missing. About 100,000 Germans were killed, wounded, or captured. The Arden campaign of 1944 to 45 was only one in a series of difficult engagements in the battle for Europe, wrote John S.D. Eisenhower in his 1969 book, The Bitter Woods. Nevertheless, it can be said that the Arden campaign epitomized them all, for it was here that American and German combat soldiers met in the decisive struggle that broke the back of the Nazi war machine. And I would add to that, it seems that this did in many ways epitomize them all, because time and again, as you've already referred to and as we've had on the program on other occasions as well reference to, we see it is prayer that shifts things, that changes the atmosphere literally, that changes weather, and that sees how God works in and through various individuals, godless though they may be, in many ways to accomplish freedom, liberty, and justice.
I mean, I think it's also very interesting, isn't it, that we are talking about the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, the German Nazi counteroffensives against the Allies. And yet we see this incredible story emerge about General Patton's prayer, and to give that to 250,000 of his troops of the Third Army to pray, to get the chaplains to pray, to get his soldiers to pray. What can we learn from this lesson today, particularly in this increasingly modern secular world that has moved away from Christianity? And if we were ever engaged in a Third World War, the only source we can turn to is the God Almighty. 30 seconds.
Well, we're seeing it in Ukraine. I've known British soldiers who are training Ukrainians who have turned to the Orthodox faith because they've seen something in the Ukrainians. And today, more than ever, we need to remind ourselves that when things are looking really desperate, that is the time that we should engage our faith and engage in prayer in the spiritual war that is all around us.
Well, thank you so much, Major Rhett, for joining us. Thank you for the work that you're involved in with the armed forces, and we'll continue to remember all the chaplains in prayer particularly. And thank you, our viewers, for this time and for thinking. And please apply yourself in prayer, not in regard just to the past, but in regard to those conflicts in the present. That's goodbye from us on Behind the Headlines.